for coming today. We all here, all settling in. My name is Stephen McGreevy. I'm part of the Feast Project. It's one of the projects here at RIHN. We're in the fourth of 5 years, and we're a project that's looking at sustainable food consumption, production, and transition in agri-food systems. We have the profound honor and pleasure to spend a month with two world-renowned scholars, Miguel Altieri, who will be speaking first, and also Clara Nicholls, who will be speaking after him. So stick around. Miguel will speak first, and then Clara will be speaking later, so make sure that you're here for both. Miguel was first probably introduced to this institute 2 years ago, I believe. Was it 3 years now? 2 years now? With the Junco Hub project, which was on the Small Scale Economies project. And through that project, actually, they were just one of the first projects here at RIHN to look at agroecology. And actually, I want to just do a quick, I guess it's a call to let people know. They produced this document, which is one of the few documents about agroecology in Japanese. And if you go to, if you Google the project, the Shokibo Keizai project, Shokibo Keizai project, and Google it, this is available for you to download. So feel free to go take a look at that later. But first, we have Miguel Altieri, who is an Emeritus Professor from University of California, Berkeley. He's one of the kind of godfathers of the agroecological movement and the science behind agroecology, and we're really, really excited to have him with us. And without further ado, Miguel, please take it away. Up here. All right.
Well, thank you very much for coming to this seminar. We're very glad to be back in RIHN. As Stephen was saying, we were here about 3 years ago, spent a month, and hopefully this month is going to be very productive. We're looking at the agenda full of activities, some conferences here and there, but also a lot of field work, because the idea is to set up a methodology to assess how we can scale up agroecological initiatives. And we will probably be giving a little report on that at the end of our stay about the advances on how we are thinking about proposing a methodology for assessing whether initiatives can be scaled up, what are the potentials, what are the limitations, and so on. But what I was asked to talk about is about agroecology and the transition to sustainable, resilient food systems, understanding that agroecology started as a discipline looking at the agroecosystem first. But later, there has been so much emphasis and understanding that farming systems are embedded in larger food systems, and therefore we need to look at a much broader picture and also incorporate different perspectives, not just agronomic, but also social, ecological, cultural, political, and economic. Thank you. So maybe I can...
You want to put it? I can hear you.
Okay. So, if we look at the agricultural landscape in the world today, we know that there's about 1.5 billion hectares of agriculture, of which 80% are large-scale monocultures, industrial systems that are highly dependent on external inputs and that have a huge ecological toll. And that's a big challenge because they utilize about 80% of the land, and they use a lot of the resources, water, energy, and also chemicals. So, despite the fact that we could be feeding ourselves with more than 250 plant species, 1,000 plant species, today there's only 3 crops that provide more than 50% of the human food or the human calories, which is corn, wheat, and rice. And this is not because we love corn, wheat, and rice, it's because there has been a whole, the whole food system has been tailored by big economic interest and also legal forces that have narrowed the crop diversity and the genetic diversity of agriculture. So there's definitely a major concern today about the decline in crop diversity worldwide, because as the crop diversity declines, the ability to agriculture to provide more varied and therefore more nutritious and healthy food for humans also decreases. And this is something that is a big concern today. For example, if you look at the United States, you can see that the extension of vegetable fruits and nuts is very minimal compared to, big cereal grains like corn and soybean. And this is again something that has been the result of an economic system. This is not because of human needs or based on human diets. So in the US, basically there has been a decline of crop diversity. Actually in 2012, it was lower than in 1978. And overall, the Corn Belt region has the lowest crop diversity if you look at the map of agriculture in the United States. And there has been a lot of concern about this genetic homogenization of agricultural systems because this could have far-reaching consequences for the provision of ecosystem services as well as that are associated with agricultural systems. So a lot of people are today talking about the need to preserve biodiversity, to restore biodiversity in agricultural landscapes. And this is a map, this is a study that just came out showing that the graphs that are more red and orange are the ones that are the regions that have experienced tremendous loss in crop diversity. Next. And it's interesting that it coincides with much the Midwest, which is the area of the United States where most of the corn and soybean production is mostly transgenic. Also coincides with the areas where the carbon residence in soils is the less. So not only you have decrease in crop diversity, you have expansion of monocultures and at the same time carbon emissions from this agricultural soil. So what are the consequences about the homogenization of agriculture and the landscapes in which agriculture is embedded? Well, there's three major problems, many more, but let me focus on three. First, increased vulnerability and potential for yield losses due to plant diseases. This is historical. If you think about, for example, the famine in Ireland, the potato famine was because of that. Loss of ecosystem services such as natural pest control and yield instability associated with erratic and rapid weather changes connected to climate change. So if we look at the first one, as I was saying, there has been many historical cases where genetic homogeneity has increased vulnerability to diseases, and in the US in 1970 there was the corn leaf epidemic, which resulted in major losses of yields in corn, which was equivalent to about 18.5 trillion calories. If you divide that by 2,000, it gives you the amount of food that was lost per person in the US at that time. Because of this vulnerability then, not only to diseases but also to insect pests and weeds and nematodes and other biotic factors, the pesticide use has increased. You can see in the world today, in 2007, not too long ago, we were applying about 5.2 billion pounds of pesticides into the environment, which is a huge ecological toll and health toll. In the US, it's estimated that $10 billion are the externalities if you account for health impacts and environmental impacts of pesticide use per year. And you can see that it's interesting, Europe, for example, which is the green one, is increasing its pesticide use despite all the environmental regulations that are in place. And other regions are also experiencing an increase in pesticide use. And we know that this ecological toll of agriculture, not only pesticide impact, but also soil erosion and air emissions, for example, of greenhouse gases. The industrial agriculture is estimated that it contributes between 30 to 45% of gas emissions, if you consider, for example, the transport of food. Water contamination, biodiversity loss, human health impacts, not only the ones that are associated directly with pesticide poisoning, but also diseases that are triggered by industrial agriculture. and soil losses, soil erosion, and so on. Well, if we account for that, there's been studies done in England that if you account for these externalities in ecological economic terms, it's about 208 pounds per hectare. This is not accounting for the removal of, for example, pesticide residues, just the impact that they have on the ecosystem. The other thing is the loss of ecosystem services. And there's a very interesting study by Landis that found that because of the expansion of ethanol and biofuel monocultures, there has been a decrease in hedgerows and natural borders and natural vegetation in agricultural landscapes, which has decreased the supply of natural enemies to soybean fields by reducing biological control by 24%. And this loss basically meant that producers had to use more pesticides and experience more yield losses, up to $58 million per year, just by fragmenting and decreasing the habitat diversity in agricultural landscapes. So basically what happens is that landscape simplification not only affects the abundance of beneficial insects, but also the richness. And that seems to be the main effect, because richness is what determines pest control, not so much the abundance, because you could have the abundance of one natural enemy which doesn't impact the pest, but if you have several natural enemies all in place, but all of them exerting pressure on that particular pest, although they're not abundant individually, that leads to pest control and therefore affecting production either positively or negatively when you lose this species diversity. So, and then the last one is obviously, as I was saying, the vulnerability to climate change. So in the Midwest in 2012, there was the worst drought in 50 years, and they experienced major losses of crop production, especially soybean and corn, in about between 15 and 30%, depending on the count. And this is interesting because if you look at the U.S. corn grain yield, historically, this is kind of the curve of the pride of U.S. agriculture. You know, they say that yields went exponentially up. But look at what happened in 2012. You can see that red spot, that's when the drought hit. And because the systems don't have diversity, they don't have organic matter, they don't have resiliency to climate change, and especially droughts. So you can see the drop in production. That's the Achilles heel of industrial agriculture in the Midwest of the US. In California also, in 2014 we had a major drought, and there were more than 400,000 acres abandoned with a cost of about 1.5 billion. Losses in just in not producing the crops, but also this doesn't account, for example, for the amount of farm workers that lost their work and they had to, return to Mexico or find other jobs in other areas. And the plantations in tropical countries like Puerto Rico are also highly devastated by these systems. I'm not going to go into resiliency because we have done a lot of work on this, showing that more diversified farms in Cuba and also in other countries have shown that they can resist hurricanes much better than monocultures. And actually we have a project that is bringing farmers from Puerto Rico and Haiti to Cuba to observe what we call the lighthouses, which are these farms that are resilient to hurricanes, so they can learn elements of design and bring them back to their country so that they can design more resilient farms, because hurricanes are going to continue coming and even more worse than ever. Next. And there's a lot of speculation about what's going to happen or what is already happening with climate change in agriculture, but there's estimations that the global decline in yield by 2050 due to climate change is about 16%, and that could lead to average food price increases in about 150%. But I think this refers more to industrial agriculture, because they're much more vulnerable than small-scale farming systems. So what is interesting is that after analyzing, these dominant systems of agriculture that are simplifying our landscapes, we find that the agro-industrial sector only produces about 30% of the food that we eat. Actually, the food that we eat comes from small farmers. But using 70 to 80% of the arable land, 70% of the water, and 80% of the fossil fuels. So it's an agriculture that is very, very inefficient in food production. What they're interested is in production of biomass, basically. Biofuels, bioplastics, and other things. So a lot of people are saying, well, we need to move these agricultural systems in the direction of more sustainability. We need to find systems that are, that are going to be environmentally sustainable, that are going to promote good food, that is going to lead to more healthy food, culturally appropriate, social equity, and vibrant, and they're going to also promote vibrant local economies. So this is basically the discourse. We need to transition towards this. Now, the features of the new agriculture that is going to have these benefits, in my opinion, they have to be decoupled from fossil fuel dependence. They have to be agroecosystems of low environmental impact, resilient to climate change, multifunctional, not only producing food, but also many other services, maintaining culture, promoting biodiversity, maintaining knowledge, etc., and vibrant local economies. And they have to be the foundation of local food systems, because by the year 2030, 80% of world population is going to live in cities, and each city of 10 million people has to import about 6,000 tons of food per day, which travels about 1,000 kilometers on average. That's totally unsustainable, so we need to move into more local food systems. And the features of this agriculture is that they are highly productive in terms of total farm output, not by commodity, but total farm output, high diversity, and high levels of efficiency that come about because of the diversification, the recycling, and the integration that happens in these systems. So a lot of people then say, well, we have these large-scale systems, monocultures, we need to move step by step in the conversion of these systems. So the first one is the increased efficiency of conventional practices. That is, for example, IPM, integrated pest management, use a little bit of chemicals but in a measured way. The second is inputs are substituted by organic or botanical or biological type of methods. The third one is the system redesign, where we use the principles of agroecology to design biodiversity-based systems that are able to sponsor their own function, because biodiversity, through the interactions, promotes these processes that are fundamental for agroecosystem function, like, for example, nutrient cycling, pest regulation, etc. And finally is agroecological connection by reestablishing the connection between the consumers and the producers at the local level. Okay? So basically the agroecological conversion in technical terms means moving from monocultures, that one above is organic, so not only monoculture and conventional but also organic, to more diversified systems that are going to be able to then to have these benefits that we all want. So why are we so interested in recovering biodiversity? There's many reasons, but three of them is that they enhance critical ecosystem services, they're more resilient to climate change, and provide more varied and therefore more nutritious food for people. So those are the three reasons why. There are many others, social, economic, and cultural, but from an agroecological perspective, those are key reasons why we want to biodiversify the systems. And there are different pathways, and this comes from IPA's report, because one is dealing with peasant agriculture, and the other one is dealing with the more industrial agriculture. How are we going to do a transition is very different for industrial countries and developing countries, and within developing countries we have also industrial agriculture and peasant agriculture, so the pathways are different. But both of them are based on reducing, in this case, mechanical inputs. In this case, some level of mechanization might be needed. Diversification in some cases might be needed, not always because they're already diversified. Connection to markets and so on is important. Next. So, in Latin America and as well as Africa and Asia and other parts, small farmers have been farming for centuries, and these are systems in the Andes that have been in place for 5,000 years. And these systems have a lot of the features that are desirable for the new systems that we want to develop today. That's why agroecologists have studied traditional agriculture for a long time, because there are so many so many connections, so many interactions, so many synergies that happen in the systems that it's very important to understand, and also the knowledge that people have about, you know, how to manage the systems, how to design them, and so on. So here's, you know, anytime we go, for example, this is in Colombia, you know, you go in Colombia, and in a particular region, in Antioquia, for example, or in the Cauca Valley, you'll find the systems in the mountains. These are, you know, you go in there, you have thousands of PhD theses, you know, only on the ecological interactions that are happening here. Why the systems have stood the test of time. Why they are able to function without external inputs, and so on and so on. And these systems, it is well known that they produce between 50 and 75% of the food that we eat, depending on the country, using 20 to 30% of the land, using very little water and very little of the fossil fuels. So it's a very, very efficient system of agriculture. And there has been many studies that have tried to explain why the systems are so efficient in food production. And one of the systems is called the MILPA, which is the Corn Bean Association, sometimes with squash and other crops in Mesoamerica. This system has been studied tremendously. There's all kinds of research. As a matter of fact, when I was a young entomologist, I did my thesis, my master's thesis on why the system didn't have pests as opposed to monocultures. And many people have studied the interactions that happen between these different crops, below soil, above soil, and you know, many of these interactions explain why the yield stability of the systems. So, next. For example, one of the reasons why farmers diversify because they want to decrease risk. They lower risks. You lose something, there's compensation. And here you can see in Costa Rica different cropping systems, and you can see that the yield variability in monocultures is much higher than in polycultures. So basically, in other words, you lose in monocultures, if there's an event, you lose your everything every 3 years, as opposed to a polyculture, you lose every 12 years. Next. And this is, for example, what I found in Boasca, which is a leafhopper attacking beans. You can see in the polyculture lower yields, lower population densities because of predators that are much higher in the polycultures. So there's all kinds of ecological theories explaining why polycultures, you know, are more attractive to beneficial insects and so on. I don't have time to go into that. And then when you look at the yields of the systems through what is called the land equivalent ratio, you can see here you have corn and beans, and you can see that you could conclude that the corn produces more than the corn in the intercrop, and the bean the same thing. But that's not the way we assess the yields of the systems. What we do is this index, which basically tells you about how efficient the resources of the land are being used, how efficient the water, the sunlight, the nutrients are being utilized. And when you plot these values, you come up with a value of 1.5, which means that you need 1.5 hectares of monoculture to get the same yield of 1 hectare of polyculture, because the system is using the resources more efficiently. That's why it's called the land equivalent ratio. Next. But then, when you're in a peasant situation, now this is in Tlaxcala, Mexico, when I was young, just coming into Berkeley as a professor, I had a graduate student called Javier Trujillo, who did a PhD with me in these systems. Then he was a professor in Mexico, Clara's professor. That's how I met Clara. So this has a sentimental value for me, in a way. Because I didn't know that this young guy was going to be professor of Clara, and then I was going to meet Clara. He changed my life to the good. But you can see these systems, when we were looking at this system only, we were looking at the milpa, corn bean, but the milpa is actually grown with alfalfa. Every 3 years they go back, alfalfa there and the milpa here. Then it's surrounded by trees of different kinds, and inside here, these two systems, there's also weeds, you know, plants that we call weeds, but farmers call quelites, which are edible plants, you know. So, but we ignored all that. And then later on, next, we started doing an analysis years later when we figured out, I said, duh. We were just looking at the corn bean, when the corn bean is embedded in a much complex system. Look at that. We found that there were 11 crops, and the yield was about 6.23 tons of those 11 crops. And the weeds were producing much more, 13.2. Because, you know, amaranthus and portulaca and Chenopodium, Malva, all these plants are eaten by these families, are part of their gastronomy. And actually many of them are C4 and they resist drought more than corn and beans. So they were providing two or three times per week 3 kilos to each family. And the fruit species that were surrounding the farm, there were 8 species, they were producing about 0.64 tons. And the income after the family was fed, whatever they could sell, the surplus, provided about $1,800. 600, 1/3 was coming from the border. So, you know, we're not used to look at these systems as agronomists, you know, because we just look at what we're specialized on. And there are complex systems that when you analyze them in this very simple way, you find out that there are all these plants that we're not considering are key for the subsistence and the economy of the family. And here you can see that the economic value of corn, the black is corn, and the rest is other secondary plants or other products of corn. Because corn, like rice, has many other uses. I remember a professor, I don't remember his name, but he's from Japan. He was in Berkeley many years ago, in the 80s. And he showed us that rice has 150 uses. The plant, not the grain, the plant. Does anybody ring a bell? Who is he? No? Okay. Anyway, next. Now, I think that the way in which peasant agriculture can be moved into in a transition beyond of what they're doing, because many of the peasant systems, there's so much to improve. They're doing the right thing. But sometimes they're embedded in landscapes that are becoming degraded and degraded and degraded. So we're very interested in seeing how can we enhance productivity and at the same time conserve natural resources in a way that by increasing the landscape matrix, by improving the landscape matrix, we conserve the resource base, but at the same time provide services for the small farmers. So basically what we're looking for is this convergence between agroecology and ecological restoration. And that will lead to what we call resilient agro-landscapes. And actually we engage in a course, in a training course on this for the last 5 years with a group in Colombia. Every July we do a course on we call it agroecological restoration. And the reason it's important is because we know that if we preserve a matrix around, for example, rice fields, this matrix is going to provide ecological services to the rice system, but at the same time, by treating the rice system agroecologically, we're not going to impact the matrix. For example, if you don't use pesticides, you're going to affect positively the matrix. And some interesting research in China shows that in those systems of rice that are embedded in these complex landscapes, you have much more predators than in the monoculture rice farms. So the monoculture rice farms are farms that are not surrounded by matrix, and the top curve is diversified farms, means rice surrounded by complex landscapes. So in other words, the diversification of the surrounding habitat leads to predator abundance. This reduces abundance of pests, and decreases use of pesticides, and at the same time increases yields. And it's a very interesting study from China, actually. They did like 90-some farms that they surveyed, and they found these trends. So, given that there's this interaction between the matrix and the agricultural system, we came up, we're interested in this concept of agroecological restoration. What is it? It's the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed, and establish an ecological relationship between the farms and the surrounding landscape in order to provide food, but at the same time conserve biodiversity. So let me give you, so this is kind of the framework: agroecology and ecological restoration. And ecological restoration works at the landscape level, agroecology at the farm level. But by putting together the two approaches, then we can lead to more resilient and productive systems. So these are some of the elements that contribute to ecological restoration. That's in Spanish, but what you can see is that you can use hedgerows, you can enrich the, you can promote agroforestry systems, silvopastoral systems within the landscape. Let me give you a concrete example. This is a farm in Colombia. You see peasant agriculture, but these peasant farmers got into the market of this crop called arracacha. It's a tuber crop. And it's the most soil-degrading tuber crop that you can think of. So they were caught in a market that was asking for this product. They degraded the soil, and obviously they couldn't produce anymore. And then the monoculture degraded the environment, but also the prices of the crop went down, and so the farmers went out of business. So what do you do with this? Well, you start restoring. So the first thing that they started doing is, okay, well, we're going to continue with this crop, but we're going to start providing hedgerows of this plant called Titonia diversifolia, which is kind of, they call it the Mexican sunflower. Next. Why? Why are we going to grow that? Because first of all, cuts the distance of the slope and therefore reduces erosion considerably. Then they started suspending the crop of arracacha, and they started growing coffee, replacing the monoculture of arracacha with coffee. Next, you can see that this plant is a tremendous source of biomass. Actually, this plant is the plant that has the highest content of phosphorus of any crop, of any plant that you can find. And actually, in these soils, there's a lot of immobilization of phosphorus. So this is a way of biologically solubilizing phosphorus and applying organic matter into the system. So this is the fertilizer, basically, that the farmers are growing. But then you can see that little by little, the system is evolving, because now it's coffee, but the coffee is not a monoculture. The coffee has many other trees for shade, and at the end, you end up with a system like this. So from that bare soil that you saw, you come up with this system that now is producing a plethora of different crops, but at the same time is preserving the environment and so on. Now this project occurs in this region called the Villavista, where the community engage in ecological restoration, not only at the farm level, but also at the watershed level. Because this is what the plant covered the watershed in 1992, and then by getting involved in a restoration, involving children, actually, women and everybody, by 2016 or something like that, yeah, 14 to 16, you can see now that the restoration of the landscape of the watershed, which is important for what? For water production. If you look at here, there was now water available for 75 families instead of 25. They improved water quality. There was also this, because of water, there was also a possibility of increasing diversification of production, reducing external inputs, and families producing about 90% of what they eat. So that's one route that we are pursuing now for transforming the agricultural systems, or improving or of peasant agriculture, but there's the challenge of how we're going to do it in modern agriculture, industrial systems. But we use the same principles of agroecology. And the challenge is how do we move from system degrading monocultures to systems that are much more diversified in the context of large-scale systems in industrial contexts. But greening, the green revolution will not work, because this is what, you see, this is what FAO and other organizations talk about when they say agroecology. What they really mean is climate smart agriculture, sustainable intensification, okay? Which is business as usual, okay? As I'm sure you have all read the IASTE report, okay? But organic farming is also going the same way. For example, this is in California. As you know, there's about 35 million hectares of organic agriculture in the world. Most of it is input substitution. So you can see these farmers are preparing the soil for planting strawberries. Then they have a monoculture. Then they do input substitution. These are Mexican farm workers. Most of them indigenous people displaced by the free trade agreement working in California, releasing a beneficial mite to control the pest here. And they do that weekly. And so what we're finding is that a lot of the agriculture is input substitution. More than 75% of the organic food in our countries, in developing countries, is exported, so that's not contribute to food security. And because of the higher cost, it only benefits certain groups, economic groups. So it doesn't democratize the food system at all. And this is what's happening in California. You can see that only about 3% of the organic farms control about 80% of the business. So there's a commodification, a corporatization of organic farming. So that's not the route that we want to take. So by applying agroecological principles in this context, we're going to change the practices in order to devise systems that are going to reach the final step of the conversion, which is the redesign of the farms. So with that, we have to break the monoculture with different diversification strategies. So then the next one, so how do we move from that to this in landscape systems, in large-scale systems? Or how do we promote this type of intercropping systems? They all exist. They're all mechanized. It's just that they are not popularized. As a matter of fact, in the Midwest of the US, this system existed back in the 50s and 60s, what they called strip intercropping. And you can see that after a cycle of 5 years, they saved $82 per hectare, per acre in the strip intercropping system compared to the monocultures, because these systems require less inputs compared to the monocultures. Then there's some studies that just came out. There's a paper on Ontario that demonstrated that when you include a small grain in the rotation of corn and soybean, or you do an underseeding with cover crops such as red clover, you have more stable yields during a 31 years cycle. And at the same time, if you practice or use tillage without Roundup, obviously, an organic system that Clara is going to show later, also providing increased corn and soybean yields during dry, hot years. So just a simple change in a rotation can increase the resiliency to climate change in these systems. And here you can see, this is the X is the one that has the clover as an undercover crop. And the rest, they go down the yields. You can see that the typical corn, soybean always loses, even hot in dry years or in wet years. So basically, a lot of people in the Midwest of the US are studying how do we somehow, if the ecosystem of reference is the prairie, the tall grass prairie, how do we start mimicking the prairie with agricultural systems? So if we look at, for example, There are differences in disturbance, in energy flows, in plant cover, in rooting depth especially. This is the wheat rooting depth, and this is the grasses of the prairie. So it is difficult to mimic a prairie with monocultures or 2 or 3 crops. So what they have done is come up with this concept of strips. So basically here you have a different treatment. So this is a monoculture, let's say corn or soybean, but now we're gonna preserve a certain amount of the prairie in the corner or as strips within the system. So in other words, like something like this. Okay, so you have prairie, and you have strips of prairie, and then you have the corn or your soybean. And the results, again, some studies that were done at Iowa State University shows that just by replacing 10% of the cropland with prairie strips, increased biodiversity and ecosystem services with minimal impacts on crop production. So the yields, the total yield that came out from that area was similar as the monoculture, but with all these other benefits that I'm not going to go into, ecosystem services, preservation, and so on and so forth. So it is possible to do this transformation. This is a system in Colombia of sugarcane. This is the dominant system, the monoculture system. And within this region, in the Cauca Valley of Colombia, there is a farm that is organic, but at the same time applies the agroecological principle. So it's not input substitution. So what do? They grow sugarcane, but in between they grow mung bean, which is a cover crop. Remember, sugarcane lasts 12 months. This crop can be grown in the first 3 months, incorporated into the soil as a green manure. Once they do that, they bring the sheep that go inside the sugarcane to control the weeds, and at the same time they're putting nutrients into the system. And they also control the weeds in between this area, because this is where the tractors are going around, when they harvest and so on. And you can see that a system like this is the yield throughout the year, despite the rainfall patterns. Whether you have drought or excess water, the stability of the yield continues all the time. Okay? And what they found also is that what made the profit of this farm was not that they were producing more than the conventional farms that were surrounding them, but the cost of production went down. That's what made the difference, the profit. So in other words, what we're finding, so these are the summaries, okay? Production 10 to 28 tons per hectare per month, stable despite variability of the climate, 4% organic matter in the soil, similar to the forest that is nearby. They're using 50% less irrigation, and they can store 1.5 liters of water per square meters of soil. And the level of attack by the atrea, which is a worm that attacks the systems, is only 1.5% compared to the neighbors that have about 15%. And this is one of the reasons why there's more damage, because there's 54 species of spiders and 28 species of ants, all predators. Okay? So this is, I think, the main advantage of agroecology when you compare it to conventional in economic terms. It's not that it produces more, it's this, it's that it decreases the cost of production, which gives you the benefits. That's basically, I think, what we're finding increasingly. It's not also that they sell more expensive. These guys sell their sugar cane. They don't sell it organic because there's a non-organic market. So all the production that they produce is mixed with the conventional, because they don't have any other route. But they make it because of this. So we're talking about this evolution from conventional to ecological intensive to organic to agroecology. That's basically what we're talking about. And there's many systems that you will find in different in different stages of evolution. And obviously that, and obviously the health and environmental risks start, the positive outcomes of on health and environment are going to be experienced as you move up into that evolution. So there's many people that are analyzing this transition of these food systems. This is FAO, saying that we're going to increase the efficiency of practices and into substitution. Then we need to transform agricultural productions to more resilient and sustainable, the redesign phase. Strengthening the market that support agroecology, and then building an enabling environment for more sustainable food systems. This is basically the framework that the agroecology program at FAO is promoting. Okay. There's other people like the French are very active in this. I've been looking at a journal called Agronomy and Sustainable Food System. Sustainable. What is it? Agronomy for Sustainable. So, for example, Duru has a paper there where they talk about 5 steps in the methodology of transforming food systems. So on the next one, you can see that you start with you analyze the system, the current system, then you have to change the governance, then you have to promote the biodiversity-based agriculture, but then it can go backwards if you don't do it right. The next methodology is from this guy Altieri. This guy came out in the same journal. What they're talking about is that there are certain niches that are open within the system. Those are the ones that can lead to a regime reconfiguration. Because the other ones, there's too many lock-ins that don't allow change. But if you are able to get a network of actors and novelties, then maybe you can exploit those niches that are open and change, and within the system do some changes. Obviously, there's this analysis of IPES that says, well, there's some lock-ins that we need to overcome that are basically centered around the concentration of power, and we need to somehow change those lock-ins. And for that, they have a set of recommendations, develop new indicators for sustainable food systems, public support short-circuit, long list that we all are familiar with, about mainstreaming agroecology, strengthening movements, etc., etc. One of the big things of that report is about changing the metrics. Instead of this type of metrics, we should move into this type of metric, and that perhaps will provide a better assessment of the situation. But in agroecology, we're talking about transforming the corporate food system, because the other approaches don't challenge the corporate control food system. And for this one, I really like what Van der Ploeg has proposed. You remember he was here. About the fact that the food empires are controlling the food system, and what he proposes is bypass. And this bypass, although is happening within a capitalist system, is not totally ruled by the market rules. It doesn't function. But there's elements of, I don't know if you have in English or in Japanese the word economía de la solidaridad, solidarity economy. So this thing is working. Yeah, there's transactional money, but there's elements of solidarity economics. And Clara, I think, is going to give some examples of that. And really, changing the food system is quite complex. This is again from IPES, where you have so many things that you have to change. From the energy subsidies, the environmental regulations, the food subsidy supply policies, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's so many things. Where do you start? Obviously, the food system, what it is the production, transformation, and distribution and consumption of food. So food production is vital for the food system. So as agroecologists, that's where we start. changing the way we produce food, the way I have explained before. And this leads next to what maybe I will talk for the seminar, with the internal seminar here at RIHN, is that we really need to find agriculture and food as a cross-cutting issue that goes into all these areas that we're seeing here. You know, everybody working in energy, working in society, working in materials, working in biodiversity, in climate, in soils, in population, whatever, we all have to deal with food. That's a cross-cutting issue. And how we're gonna approach it from each perspective, and how we're gonna come up with an integrated approach to really change the way we farm and produce food that is going to be healthy, sustainable, resilient. Thank you. So I don't know if there's time for questions.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Miguel. Yes, there is time for some questions from the audience. Have some time.
Yes.
Yes.
I'm going to remind you that it's 11 o'clock.
Hi, Miguel, welcome back.
Thank you.
I've already asked you many questions in the past. So I want to focus on something that you brought up, but you didn't maybe have a chance to talk about much, was the quelitas, edible weeds, kind of food sources, nutrition sources that are not often considered or calculated either by statistics or even really noticeably by families. They may not really consider them when they discuss their diet. Do you have any good news on that front? Like these calculations of this starting to be more viable? I'm looking at it from the more classical nutritionist standpoint, and it's very difficult because bringing wild plants into the diet is, just so many hurdles. The hygiene part, the lack of data on what nutrition is, the safety issue, the fact that these are not grown and so they don't have a strict season that people can integrate into gastronomy in a specific way. Maybe you can talk about if anything you've encountered about that.
You know, it's interesting because there has been very, very little research about this in the sense that there's been a lot of work on orphan crops, like crops that have been forgotten, but not on quelitas, which are an integral part of agricultural systems in traditional farming. And you know, in Mexico there has been some studies done by ethnobotanists. A lot of ethnobotanists have calculated how much biomass they produce. They are very important during times of crop scarcity, etc., etc. And there's also a lot of research showing that many of these plants also have ecological services, for example, attract beneficial insects. He's doing some research here on some aspects. It would be interesting to invite him to give a talk about what he's doing. Many of these plants are medicinal, also, in addition to that. And it's not, and the other thing is that the reason why they were ignored, I would say, by the conventional agricultural establishment is because it was a sign of, we call it dirty farming. You know, like, these guys are messy, are flojos, how do you say flojos? Lazy. Lazy. Because they couldn't understand that these plants had a use. And they're part. Also, many of them are rituals, plants that are used in rituals. So, the corn, bean, squash, the famous milpa, in a way is misrepresented also, because it's not just those three crops. There are many other white plants that are associated with the system that are important in the system. So it's a co-evolved system. I don't have much more news about it other than that. I think that some nutritionists are working on it. I know some people that are that are looking at these plants that are becoming part of the gastronomy in certain parts of Peru, for example. But I think the emphasis is more on local varieties, orphan crops, but this resource is kind of under the radar, I would say, right now, of nutritionists, agronomists, economists, everybody. I think it's time to bring it back to where it belongs. And it's interesting because there's some papers, with this whole golden rice fever in Asia. It turns out that many of the quelites in the rice paddies, at least in Indonesia and Thailand, where studies were done, show that they had 500 more beta-carotene than the golden rice. The golden rice has 30 micrograms of beta-carotene per gram, where these other quelites have like 500. So you have to eat 2 kilos of golden rice to get the same beta-carotene that you get from one leaf of one of those quelites that are being eliminated by the Roundup of the Green Revolution. So I think that the case can be made, but it's under the radar of academia and development circles, but it's not under the radar of farmers, which is what is important. I think our role is to bring that to the forefront, because, as I said, not only they provide additional food, but also they provide many ecological services, among them the issue of pest reduction through providing habitat for beneficial insects.
Great question. Any other questions? Yeah.
So thank you for your interesting talk. So I'm very curious about the joy of the farmers, because some agroecological farming practice is clearly, apparently, it requires more complicated practice. I guess, but I think sometimes it means the farmers need the creativity is necessary for farmers. So I feel it is not at all the standardized farming works. You mean it's very different from the hired farm workers, and being a very independent and very creativeness is. So can you briefly show about that part of it?
Well, one of the arguments that actually Via Campesina has made is that because when you do the diversified farming systems, you take the monotony away from the farming. So that's one aspect. But the other one, it has to do with the fact that I think in our experience with Clara visiting many of the farmers, is that this conversion that happens in the system also parallels an internal conversion of the farmer. I mean, it's not just the transition of the farm, the transition of the farmer to a higher level of, consciousness or awareness, and the relationship that they have with the land and the plants. It's pretty amazing. There are farmers that tell you that the plants talk to them. The plant is telling me this, and they feel that they have a communication, but just, I don't know, by reading signs of the plant, and they know what the plant is asking me. We have heard this many times from farmers, that the plants are asking me this, and the farmer is able to provide that. There's a certain level of communication that comes with that co-evolution. So definitely, I think it's much more creative, and we have tried to bring that perspective, that innovation, creativity, in projects that we were doing in California with vineyards, because it turns out that in California, the organic farmers that have vineyards, they hired what they call scouts, which are these people that come in motorcycles and sample the plants to see how many pests they have and so on. And it turns out that the farm workers, the ones that are cutting, pruning, and they're every day, every hour in the field. And we told the owners, why don't we train these farmers, and then they do that work instead of the scouts, but you pay them more. And the farm workers really appreciate it because they felt that they were using their intellect and the knowledge that they had, because they all come from farming backgrounds. The farm workers in California are all indigenous farmers in Mexico. So the fact that and it's interesting because they were telling us, because we were growing flowers in the vineyards to attract artificial insects, and they call it la milpa, the milpa. Where were you? In the milpa, in the vineyard, because now it looks like a milpa. And so there was some kind of a cultural connection to the system. And then on top of that, by being trained on these beneficial insects, and we could do that because we speak Spanish, so we train all these farm workers. And then they would get engaged in the things that they have to do, pruning, weeding, whatever, but at the same time observing. And it was really interesting when we did the workshops later, and they would come with all these observations that they had. Oh yeah, in this plant we find this spider, and this and that and that. And they felt engaged in an intellectual activity that proved, that made the work much more interesting than just mechanical work. So that dimension, I think, is very important.
Questions? Yes, Miguel?
Can you put it this way?
Introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Leila Chacron from Switzerland, doing a PhD on permaculture. And my question was slightly related to what she asked. Do you have a kind of a level of consulting for farmers? Like, is it voluntarily basis? Like, for example, that the transition we saw on the kind of hill from this raging, devastating crop to a polyculture mountainous area, was it the initiative of the farmer, or you identified, like who identified what might be restored and how? Like what's your role as a researcher?
Okay, you're talking about the example of the Arracacha?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that community, that particular community was, there was an NGO called CIPAB that came there about 25 years ago to work on the restoration, to help them restore the watershed. By teaching them reforestation and so on, and they did it in a very interesting way. They did it by involving children. So they created a group called the Herederos del Planeta, the Planet Inheritors. That was the name. It's children. And these children stayed in the community. Actually, they went. In that community, there's one PhD and 3 masters. Peasants, sons and daughters of peasants, that went to the university and came back. And their thesis was about how we're going to restore the system. Now that we have water, how are we going to restore the system? So, in a way, what happened with these kids is that they went and they learned about technical aspects in the university, which they were not very useful because most of the universities are teaching conventional agriculture, but they gave them background on entomology, soils, etc. And together with the NGO, that is really an NGO that works on agroecology, they were able to set up a plan of restoration of the farms. So it's kind of a combination of local knowledge and outside knowledge. But the initiative came from them. They became motivated. Because as children, they were involved in the process. So now it's interesting to see now, these people are what, 30 years old now?
No.
From 5 to 30 years old.
He was a kid.
Huh?
Julian farm.
Yeah.
He was a kid.
Yeah. Julian, that farm that we saw, he was a 6-year-old kid, restoring the forest. Now he's restoring his farm. And So that's kind of a unique example, but I think that in other communities that I didn't show examples, for example in Chile, there's been a lot of restoration going on, has always been some outsider coming in, but that outsider becomes part of the community. I mean, for example, SET, which is an NGO in Chile, which we report back in the paper on amplification of agroecology. That person that came there and set up a project, an NGO-based project, has been there 35 years. So what they did was they established a model farm together with the community, and that model farm became a school demonstration to other farmers in the area. And that's how it started spreading in the process. So I think that our role, although we are not engaged in the projects, on a daily basis, our role is always facilitating more than facilitation. Provide some elements that are going to allow them for either training or some methodological elements or something that will help the process to continue growing.
Questions? Yeah. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. My question is about the transition and change. I'm curious about your opinion regarding the role of the institutionalized politics, or what is evolved, how, for example, in Europe there is a common agricultural policy, or there is debate about how this common agricultural policy can create change in agriculture. Do you think that this kind of policy can have a real role in the transition to an agroecological system or not?
Good question.
Thank you.
Well, we were talking about this in the morning. There's so many reports out there, about how are we going to transition to a sustainable agriculture, from the IPES to FAO to the IPES to the IPPC. There's the Millennium Goals, all these things. But if you really look at the recommendations that come out of this, are all to maintain the status quo. They don't recognize, like Van der Ploeg does, that the root cause of the crisis, and I'm not talking about only the crisis of agriculture, I'm talking about the planetary ecological crisis, is the result of an economic system that has been, predating on the environment and on people and so on, which is basically capitalism. And so none of these recommendations, none of these reports will go to the root cause of the problem because they're financed by the same system. So there are reformist approaches. There are niches that are left in the system that we can somehow fill in, but they don't pretend to transform. So agroecology is transformative, and that's why there's this divide that we experienced in 2014 at the FAO conference. First agroecology conference of FAO was about agroecology, okay? And immediately it was clear that there was a divide. One, the Via Campesina, SOCLA, which is the Latin American Agroecology Society, and the rest, all the institutions, World Bank, CDIR, all these people that were saying that agroecology is one more tool within the toolbox, together with genetic engineering, climate smart agriculture, this and that and that and that. And that was it. And we said, no, agroecology is the antithesis of that, it's the alternative to all that. It's its own paradigm. It doesn't have to be, it's transformative, it's not performance. Well, in 2000, when was it the second? 2018. 2018, None of those that said when we questioned, were part of the agenda. Now it was all the CIF people, the World Bank people, the French, etc., etc. It's not that I have anything against them, but some of them, I debated, for example, I'm not going to say names, but I debated one of the main actors of IPES now. He didn't believe in agroecology 6 years ago. We had a huge argument. And now he's the white dove of agroecology. So there's a huge co-option happening. A huge co-option of agroecology happening, institutional, which is actually promoting the same technical, ecological principles, but leaving totally aside the political and social dimensions that the Anapesina and the food sovereignty framework brings. And that's what I think is happening. So I think that we need to create a bypass. Because we're not going to change, corporate agriculture. We're not going to transform these huge landscapes that dominate the world today, the agricultural landscape that dominate. But we can make change at the local level. Whether the summation of local changes is going to lead to global change, I don't know. But at least what I see from experiences that we have studied on the lighthouses is that there are spaces of hope, that it is possible to promote change at the local level. It is possible to do it, despite the huge structure at the regional and world level that is biased against those initiatives. Those initiatives are happening, and it's all over the world. There are many, many experiences. So I think that from our perspective, the way to go is to, how are we going to scale up those initiatives? How can we scale them up within the limits that the corporate controlled food system is going to impose? Okay? And governments really don't have much power on what's happening in agriculture. And if they do, they respond to the big ones. For example, I don't know how much the EU policy is influenced by big interests, but in the United States, the Farm Bill is totally influenced by the lobbies of big agribusiness. And so sometimes, we have experienced this so many times. I mean, look at what happened in Brazil. Brazil has a national law of agroecology that was a product of social movements that pushed the politicians to change the system, and they created the law. Now we have an extreme right-wing government that basically just didn't get rid of the law, but didn't finance it. So that's it. But he's not responding to his political, he's not acting based on his political views. It's the pressure of agribusiness that made him cancel that law. We'll see what happens, 3 or 4 more years. But basically that's what's happening. So all these things cannot be left. I don't think the transition can be left to the rhythms of politics. They have to continue going despite whatever government policies are there. And I always say this, to FAO and to other organizations, and perhaps that's not why I'm so popular in those environments anymore, is that we did agroecology without you, and we will continue doing it without you. Because you see, agroecology got to a point that it is without any government support, without FAO support, without institutional support. It grew with 1% probably of the funding that the CGIR system receives. But look at where it got. So it seems to me that agroecology, because it's based on social movements, which Clara is going to talk about, transcends whatever support. If there's policy support from the government, fantastic, but there's not, it continues going. I think that's the autonomous nature of agriculture, which gives it its strength.
Great discussion right now, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. And then I would like to know about your opinion on the consumers' roles. So if are there any initiatives where the consumers took an important role in terms of the transition of the conventional farming into the agroecological system? Because we are talking about the solidarity economy, I think we have to get those consumers involved, as many as possible. So I would, if you can elaborate about any initiatives or experiences that you have experienced, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, we're all consumers, and we cannot put the burden of changing the food system on the farmers. But the problem is, how do we get involved the majority of the consumers, which are the poor? Which are the poor people. Those are the majority, see? Because, you see, the food system narrative in the United States is driven by the middle class and upper class. When they say, well, we can transform the system with our fork and with our wallet. Yeah, but the majority of the people, the poor people, and we're talking about at least 60 or 70% of humankind, is out of the loop of that narrative. So the challenge is, how are we going to democratize the food systems so that those people can influence the system? Because it turns out that most of these people, unfortunately, are the ones that are receiving the cheap food and the unhealthy food. And the rest, the ones that talk about these things, we are the fortunate ones, the privileged ones that can have access to better food. So I think that's one key challenge that we need to confront, right? Face on. Like, how do we democratize the food system so that the poor, and for that, the right to food has to become a policy for all. It's a human right, and from that build up. So that's one perspective. The second perspective is, I think that we need to broaden the understanding of the consumers of the food system, because all has been about healthy food and organic food, or etc., environmentally safe food. All that stuff is great, but it's not enough. I think that we need to understand. We need to get the people involved so that they understand that changing agriculture can also benefit them in many, many other ways. Not only in terms of health and nutrition, but also in the quality of life. For example, I think I've mentioned this before, but there are studies that were done in California many, many years ago by a rural sociologist from Davis, a Japanese last name. I don't know if the person from California knows. What was his name? Anyway, he found that in small towns surrounded by small farms, there was less drug addiction, less family violence, and less other negative things compared to small towns surrounded by large-scale farms. So you start thinking, why would that happen? Well, there's much more social connection between the farmers and the consumers in the small towns surrounded by small farms than towns surrounded by large-scale farms that are kind of social voids, social deserts in a way. They also found, for example, in Brazil, in towns in Sao Paulo, little towns surrounded by small-scale farms were 5 to 10 degrees cooler than towns surrounded by large-scale sugarcane plantations. Hidaka did some studies here in RIHN. He showed me some studies many years ago showing that the water coming from watersheds of natural farming were pure, more pure than the water coming from watersheds of conventional rice farming. So when you start looking at all these things, like, okay, well, agriculture can benefit my quality of life in many other ways, not just by, so if I support small-scale farmers, you know, around my cities, this is going to provide many, many benefits to my family, to my livelihood. And then the connection with health today that go beyond just the studies of whether, you know, whether if you eat, you know, organic and nutritious food, you're going to be in better shape. Although, let me tell you that I just saw a study last week, hasn't been published yet, but somebody reported it last week. In Switzerland, where you have the most rigorous rules on organic farming, organic farms that are immersed in these landscapes where there's conventional farms had the same level of pesticide residues than the conventional farms. So, because of contamination through water, through air, so I don't know if organic is a guarantee anymore about food that has no pesticides. Honey, for example, the biggest integrators of the landscape are bees. Even if you have an organic farm where you have your bees, the honey of your honey is going to be totally contaminated because they go all over the landscape and they start collecting from different flowers in the landscape, and they bring. And actually, studies show that it magnifies the concentration once they get into a hive. So I think that we need to. So the studies that are being done now by doctors, especially pediatricians, are showing that children that are fed organic have less allergies, less diseases, and there's some very interesting study about the gut microbiology of children that feed on organic food compared to the conventional one. And the hyperactivity, children that are hyperactive, if you feed them organic, they quiet down. They quiet down, and then they feed them McDonald's and the hyperactivity goes up. It's a study by, what's her name? Daphne Miller, very interesting. So, to summarize, if we bring all these studies that are showing, you know, that health, you know, agroecological food is more nutritious, it has less pesticides, whatever, hopefully, but at the same time brings all these benefits, you know, in terms of climate change, in terms of quality of life for my children, in terms of social cohesion in the community, less crime, less violence, all these things, then people, if they understand that, people will go for a change in agriculture. And you know what? Somebody that is bringing that issue right now is Bernie Sanders. I don't know if you heard that. He's a candidate in the US. Second time he's going to be a candidate. Who knows if he's going to get nominated. But he's talking about changing agriculture and along these lines. It's interesting, some of the proposals that he's making are very similar to the proposals of the Via Campesina. Maybe you read the Via Campesina declaration of Miguel or whatever. But he's talking about a lot of things. About disrupting the corporate food system, creating more diversity in the rural areas, all kinds of things.
All right. Fantastic. I think we could go on and have Miguel talk, but we've gone on for about an hour and a half. We want to have a little bit of a break before we go into Clara's talk, so continue the discussion afterwards. Let's give Miguel another round of applause, though. So Clara will begin her talk in 30 minutes. Come on back then. Thank you.